Introduction. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you put yourself first without feeling guilty? If that question makes you pause, we need to talk. Overgiving isn't generosity. It's self-sacrifice disguised as kindness. And if you're always the one giving, supporting, and showing up, but feeling drained in return, then this message is for you. Overgiving isn't generosity, it's self-sacrifice at your own expense. This is a hard truth to accept, especially for those who have been conditioned to believe that giving endlessly is a sign of kindness, love, or strength. But when we strip away the illusion, we see that overgiving isn't an act of abundance. It's an act of depletion. It's not about having so much to give that you freely pour into others. It's about giving even when you don't have enough, even when it drains you, even when it leaves you with nothing. And that isn't generosity, that's self-neglect. When we overgive, we aren't just being kind. We are often unconsciously trying to prove something. Maybe it's the belief that if we do enough, we will finally feel worthy. Maybe it's the fear that if we stop giving, people will stop valuing us. Maybe it's an old habit learned from childhood where love and approval were tied to how much we did for others. Whatever the root cause, overgiving is never just about the other person. It's about us, about our fears, our insecurities, our need for validation. True generosity comes from a place of choice, not obligation. When you give because you genuinely want to, when you give without resentment, when you give and still have enough left for yourself, that is generosity. But when you give out of guilt, out of fear, out of habit, or because you believe that's the only way to be valuable, then it's not generosity anymore. It's sacrifice. And the problem with sacrifice is that it demands a cost. The cost might be your time, your energy, your mental health, or even your self-respect. And over time, that cost becomes too high. Think about the times you've given so much that you felt exhausted, frustrated, or unappreciated. That feeling isn't coming from generosity, it's coming from depletion. It's the weight of constantly pouring into others without being poured into. And the more you do it, the more people expect it. The world doesn't stop to check if you're okay, it simply takes what you offer. And if you never set limits, if you never say enough, people will assume you have an endless supply to give. The truth is, you don't. No one does. You cannot keep sacrificing yourself and expect to thrive. You cannot keep overgiving and expect to feel whole. At some point, you have to recognize that constantly giving at your own expense isn't noble. It's destructive. The most valuable thing you can do is not to give endlessly, but to give wisely. And that starts with understanding that your worth is not measured by how much you sacrifice for others. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Yet so many of us do. We stretch ourselves thin, say yes when we want to say no, and exhaust ourselves trying to meet the needs of everyone around us. We convince ourselves that if we just give a little more, show up a little more, sacrifice a little more, then maybe we'll be appreciated, loved, or needed. But the truth is, when you burn yourself out for others, they don't see the fire. They only see the warmth. They don't see how much it's costing you. They just see that you're always there, always giving, always available. And the more you do it, the more they expect it. It starts subtly. Maybe you take on extra responsibilities at work, thinking it will earn you recognition. Maybe you always listen to your friends' problems, but never get a chance to share your own. Maybe you constantly put your family's needs before your own, believing that's what love looks like. At first, it seems manageable. But over time, you start feeling drained. You start feeling unseen. You wonder why no one notices how much effort you're putting in, how much you're sacrificing, how tired you are. And that's where the resentment builds. The hard truth is, people will take what you give them, not because they are selfish, but because you've trained them to. You've shown them that you'll always be there, that you don't need anything in return, that your needs don't come first. So why would they question it? Why would they assume you need help when you've never asked for it? It's not their responsibility to notice your suffering. It's yours to stop setting yourself on fire in the first place. The problem with constantly overextending yourself is that it's unsustainable. Sooner or later you burn out. You either withdraw completely, exhausted from the constant giving, or you explode, frustrated that no one seems to see what you're going through. Either way, the outcome isn't healthy. What's healthier is recognizing that your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's. that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, that you are allowed to say no. It might feel uncomfortable at first. You might worry that people will be disappointed, that they'll think less of you. But the right people, the ones who genuinely care, will respect your boundaries. The ones who only valued you for what you gave will resist. And that's when you'll see the truth. The people who truly love you won't need you to set yourself on fire for them. They'll want you to stand in your own light, whole, strong, and thriving. People-pleasing is a one-way ticket to burnout. At first it seems harmless, even admirable. You want to make others happy. You want to be seen as dependable, kind, and generous. You want to avoid conflict, disappointment, or the uncomfortable feeling that comes with saying no, so you say yes. Yes to extra responsibilities at work. Yes to emotional labor in your relationships. Yes to being available at all times, even when you're exhausted. And each time you convince yourself it's the right thing to do. But here's the problem. People-pleasing isn't about kindness. It's about fear. The fear of rejection. The fear of being disliked. The fear that if you don't give, you won't be valued. And the more you give, the more you reinforce the belief that your worth is tied to how much you can do for others. That if you stop saying yes, you'll stop being needed. But the more you live for the approval of others, the further you drift from yourself. You start to notice it in small ways. You feel exhausted, but you push through. You feel resentful, but you suppress it. You crave rest, but you ignore it. And every time you override your own needs to accommodate someone else's, you chip away at your own well-being. The people around you don't even realize it's happening because to them, you've always been the person who says yes. You've trained them to expect it. So when you finally start setting boundaries, it feels unfamiliar, not just to them, but to you. The most dangerous part of people-pleasing is that it convinces you that self-sacrifice is love. That if you care enough, you'll always put others first. But real love, real connection, doesn't require you to abandon yourself. The people who truly care about you don't need you to be everything for them. They don't need you to run yourself into the ground to prove your loyalty. They value you for who you are, not for how much you give. Breaking free from people-pleasing means learning to tolerate the discomfort of disappointing others. It means realizing that your time, energy, and emotional capacity are limited resources, and that it's okay to protect them. It means understanding that saying no doesn't make you unkind, selfish, or difficult. It makes you honest. And honesty is what builds real, lasting relationships. When you stop people-pleasing, the people who only valued you for your compliance will fade away. And the ones who remain, they'll be the ones who respect you, not for what you do for them, but for who you are. Giving without boundaries leads to resentment, not connection. At first, it might not seem that way. It feels good to help, to support, to be the person others rely on. You believe that being generous and selfless will strengthen your relationships, that always being there for people will make them appreciate you. But over time, something shifts. The more you give, the more is expected. The more available you make yourself, the less people consider your own needs. You start to feel drained, undervalued, maybe even invisible. The harsh truth is that when you give without limits, people don't necessarily see it as kindness, they see it as the standard. They assume you're okay with always showing up, always saying yes, always stretching yourself thin, and when you do finally reach a breaking point, when you express frustration or exhaustion, they don't understand. Because to them, nothing has changed. You've always been the giver. You've always put others first. Why would they think you need anything different now? This is where resentment builds. Not because you don't want to give, but because you feel like you have no choice. You start to feel taken for granted, overlooked, unappreciated. You begin questioning why no one checks in on you the way you check in on them. Why no one offers you the same energy you've poured into them. But the real question is, did you ever set the expectation that your needs matter too? Or did you silently hope that people would just notice? The truth is, connection is not built on overextending yourself. It's built on mutual respect. And respect requires boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines that show others how you deserve to be treated. They teach people that your time is valuable, that your energy is not limitless, that your kindness is not an open invitation to be taken advantage of. When you set boundaries, you create space for real connection. Because in relationships where only one person gives and the other only takes, connection is not genuine, it's imbalanced. People may resist your boundaries at first. They may not like hearing no from someone who has always said yes. But those who truly care about you will adjust. They will respect your limits because they respect you. And the ones who don't, they were only there for what you gave them, not for who you are. Letting go of limitless giving doesn't mean you stop being generous. It means you start being intentional. It means you choose where your energy goes, who deserves your time, and when to step back. It means you recognize that giving should come from a place of abundance, not obligation. Because when you constantly give without receiving, you don't build deeper connections, you build exhaustion. And in the end, the relationships worth keeping are the ones where you are valued for more than just what you can offer. Saying no is not rejection, it's self-respect. Too often, we associate saying no with letting people down, with disappointing them, with pushing them away. We fear that if we refuse a request, set a boundary, or prioritize ourselves, we will be seen as selfish or unkind. But the reality is, saying yes to everything doesn't make you a good person. It makes you a person who is overextended, exhausted, and often resentful. And that's not kindness. That's self-abandonment. When you say yes to things that drain you, that take away your energy, that push you beyond your limits, you are not being generous. You are neglecting yourself. The people who truly care about you don't want you to give at the cost of your well-being. They want you to be honest. They want you to show up fully, not half empty. And that can only happen when you start recognizing that your time and energy are valuable and that protecting them is not selfish, it's necessary. Think about the times you've said yes when you wanted to say no. Maybe it was taking on extra work because you didn't want to seem unhelpful. Maybe it was agreeing to plans when you really needed rest. Maybe it was listening to someone unload their problems when you barely had the emotional energy to handle your own. At the moment, it felt easier to say yes than to deal with the discomfort of saying no. But afterward, what did you feel? Probably frustration, probably exhaustion, probably regret. That feeling is a sign that your boundaries were crossed, not by others, but by yourself. Because every time you say yes to something that drains you, you are saying no to something else, your own peace, your own needs, your own priorities. And if you continue this pattern, you start losing yourself in the process. You become the person who is always there for everyone else, but never there for yourself. The truth is, the people who truly respect you will respect your boundaries. They may not always like hearing no, but they will understand it. And if someone only values you when you are saying yes, then they don't truly value you. They value what you do for them. That's an important distinction. Learning to say no takes practice. It takes courage. It takes unlearning the belief that your worth is tied to your availability. But once you start, you will feel lighter. You will feel more in control of your life. You will realize that saying no doesn't push the right people away. It makes space for the relationships, opportunities, and moments that actually align with you. Because in the end, the most powerful thing you can do is honor yourself. Overgiving often stems from the fear of not being enough. Deep down, many of us have internalized the belief that our worth is tied to what we can do for others. We think that if we give more, sacrifice more, show up more, then maybe, just maybe, we will finally feel valued, appreciated, or loved. But this mindset is a trap. No amount of overgiving will ever be enough to convince you of your own worth if you don't believe it already. If you don't feel worthy at your core, you will always feel the need to prove yourself through giving. And that cycle will never end. The truth is, overgiving is often less about generosity and more about validation. It's a subconscious attempt to earn approval, to avoid rejection, to make sure we are needed. But the problem with tying our self-worth to what we can do for others is that it puts our value in their hands. It makes our sense of self dependent on their reactions, their gratitude, their acknowledgement. And when that acknowledgement doesn't come, or when it stops feeling like enough, we feel empty. We wonder why, after giving so much, we still don't feel fulfilled. The answer is simple. Worthiness isn't something you earn, it's something you recognize. You are not valuable because of what you do for others, you are valuable because you exist. But if you've spent years equating love with sacrifice, this can be hard to accept. You may feel guilty when you put yourself first. You may feel uncomfortable when you set boundaries. You may fear that if you stop overgiving, people will stop valuing you. But the reality is, the people who love you for who you are, not just for what you provide, will still be there. Releasing the need to overgive doesn't mean you stop being kind or generous. It means you start giving from a place of fullness, not emptiness. It means you give because you choose to, not because you feel like you have to. It means you stop looking for validation and the approval of others and start finding it within yourself. When you realize that you are enough, just as you are, something shifts. You stop giving out of fear, and you start giving out of love. You stop overextending yourself, and you start protecting your energy. You stop trying to prove your worth, and you start embracing it. And when that happens, your relationships change. You attract people who respect you, who see you, who value you, not just for what you do, but for who you are, because the moment you stop overgiving is the moment you start reclaiming yourself. And that is where true connection, true love, and true fulfillment begin. When you overgive, you teach people how to treat you, not by what you say, but by what you allow. Every time you put yourself last, every time you stretch yourself thin, every time you dismiss your own needs for the sake of others, you are sending a message whether you realize it or not. You are showing people that your time is not as valuable as theirs, that your energy is always available, that your needs are negotiable. And people, often without even meaning to, will follow that script. They will continue to take as long as you continue to give. It's easy to blame others when we feel taken advantage of. But the truth is, people don't take advantage of you without your participation. If you never set limits, how will they know where the boundary is? If you never say no, how will they know that you have a limit? If you never express your needs, how will they know you have them? Most people are not mind readers. They operate based on what you demonstrate. And if you consistently show up as the person who always says yes, who always gives more, who never asks for anything in return, they will believe that's just who you are. The shift happens when you recognize that you have the power to retrain people in how they treat you. This doesn't mean cutting people off or becoming distant. It means showing up differently. It means setting boundaries without apology. It means making it clear that your time, energy, and well-being are just as important as anyone else's. It means choosing yourself even when it feels uncomfortable. At first, people may resist the change. They may not understand why the person who always said yes is suddenly saying no. They may feel confused, maybe even frustrated, but the ones who truly care will adapt. They will respect the new version of you, the one who honors their own limits, and the ones who don't, they were never truly invested in you. They were invested in what you provided. You get to decide how people treat you by deciding how you treat yourself. The more you respect your own time, the more others will respect it. The more you value your energy, the more others will value it too. The more you believe that your needs matter, the more you will attract people who believe that as well. It all starts with you. You are not just a giver. You are not just what you offer to others. You are a whole person deserving of the same love, care, and attention that you so freely give to everyone else. And when you start living from that truth, everything changes. Overgiving does not build stronger relationships. It builds dependency. When you constantly show up as the person who always says yes, who always fixes problems, who always makes sacrifices, you create an unspoken expectation. The people around you begin to rely on your giving, not because they are taking advantage of you on purpose, but because you have trained them to expect it. And over time, the relationship stops being balanced. It becomes one-sided. You give, they take, and without realizing it, you start to feel the weight of it all. The danger in this cycle is that it feels like connection, but it isn't. True connection is built on mutual respect, shared effort, and a balance of giving and receiving. But when you are the one constantly giving, you are not forming real connections. You are building a role for yourself, a role where your worth is tied to how much you do for others. And that is not a sustainable or fulfilling way to maintain relationships. Think about the relationships where you have overgiven. Have you ever felt resentful? Have you ever wondered why no one puts in the same effort for you? That feeling is not selfishness. It is your intuition telling you that something is off, that you are carrying too much, that the relationship is not as balanced as it should be, that you are being valued for what you offer, not for who you are. And the hardest part? The moment you start pulling back, setting boundaries, or choosing yourself, the dynamic shifts. Some people may not like it. They may get frustrated, accuse you of changing, or even make you feel guilty for no longer showing up in the way they have come to expect. But that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of how the relationship was structured. Because in healthy, balanced relationships, your value is not dependent on how much you give. You are allowed to receive too. Breaking the cycle of overgiving does not mean you stop caring. It means you start caring in a way that is sustainable, where your generosity is a choice, not an obligation. It means recognizing that love, friendship, and support should never be one-sided. It means understanding that the strongest relationships are built on mutual effort, where both people contribute, respect each other's limits, and honor each other's needs. When you stop overgiving, you don't lose relationships. You redefine them. You make space for the people who truly value you, not just for what you do, but for who you are. And that is the kind of connection worth having. Overgiving does not build stronger relationships, it builds dependency. When you constantly show up as the person who always says yes, who always fixes problems, who always makes sacrifices, you create an unspoken expectation. The people around you begin to rely on your giving, not because they are taking advantage of you on purpose, but because you have trained them to expect it. And over time, the relationship stops being balanced. It becomes one-sided. You give, they take, and without realizing it, you start to feel the weight of it all. The danger in this cycle is that it feels like connection, but it isn't. True connection is built on mutual respect, shared effort, and a balance of giving and receiving. But when you are the one constantly giving, you are not forming real connections. You are building a role for yourself, a role where your worth is tied to how much you do for others. And that is not a sustainable or fulfilling way to maintain relationships. Think about the relationships where you have overgiven. Have you ever felt resentful? Have you ever wondered why no one puts in the same effort for you? That feeling is not selfishness. It is your intuition telling you that something is off, that you are carrying too much, that the relationship is not as balanced as it should be, that you are being valued for what you offer, not for who you are. And the hardest part? The moment you start pulling back, setting boundaries, or choosing yourself, the dynamic shifts. Some people may not like it. They may get frustrated, accuse you of changing, or even make you feel guilty for no longer showing up in the way they have come to expect. But that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of how the relationship was structured. Because in healthy, balanced relationships, your value is not dependent on how much you give. You are allowed to receive too. Breaking the cycle of overgiving does not mean you stop caring. It means you start caring in a way that is sustainable, where your generosity is a choice, not an obligation. It means recognizing that love, friendship, and support should never be one-sided. It means understanding that the strongest relationships are built on mutual effort, where both people contribute, respect each other's limits, and honor each other's needs. When you stop overgiving, you don't lose relationships. You redefine them. You make space for the people who truly value you, not just for what you do, but for who you are. And that is the kind of connection worth having. Overgiving does not build stronger relationships, it builds dependency. When you constantly show up as the person who always says yes, who always fixes problems, who always makes sacrifices, you create an unspoken expectation. The people around you begin to rely on your giving, not because they are taking advantage of you on purpose, but because you have trained them to expect it. And over time, the relationship stops being balanced. It becomes one-sided. You give, they take, and without realizing it, you start to feel the weight of it all. The danger in this cycle is that it feels like connection, but it isn't. True connection is built on mutual respect, shared effort, and a balance of giving and receiving. But when you are the one constantly giving, you are not forming real connections. You are building a role for yourself, a role where your worth is tied to how much you do for others. And that is not a sustainable or fulfilling way to maintain relationships. Think about the relationships where you have overgiven. Have you ever felt resentful? Have you ever wondered why no one puts in the same effort for you? That feeling is not selfishness. It is your intuition telling you that something is off, that you are carrying too much, that the relationship is not as balanced as it should be, that you are being valued for what you offer, not for who you are. And the hardest part? The moment you start pulling back, setting boundaries, or choosing yourself, the dynamic shifts. Some people may not like it. They may get frustrated, accuse you of changing, or even make you feel guilty for no longer showing up in the way they have come to expect. But that is not a reflection of your worth. That is a reflection of how the relationship was structured. Because in healthy, balanced relationships, your value is not dependent on how much you give. You are allowed to receive too. Breaking the cycle of overgiving does not mean you stop caring. It means you start caring in a way that is sustainable, where your generosity is a choice, not an obligation. It means recognizing that love, friendship, and support should never be one-sided. It means understanding that the strongest relationships are built on mutual effort, where both people contribute, respect each other's limits, and honor each other's needs. When you stop overgiving, you don't lose relationships, you redefine them. You make space for the people who truly value you, not just for what you do, but for who you are. And that is the kind of connection worth having. Overgiving often disguises itself as selflessness, but in reality, it can be a form of self-neglect. We tell ourselves that we are just being kind, that we are just helping, that it's what good people do. But when giving comes at the expense of our own well-being, when it drains us instead of fulfilling us, it is no longer generosity. It is a pattern of putting ourselves last. And the longer we do it, the harder it becomes to recognize where we end and where others begin. When you give endlessly without considering your own needs, you slowly start to lose yourself. You forget what you want, what you need, what truly brings you joy. Your identity becomes wrapped up in being the person who is always there for others, the one who fixes things, the one who can be counted on no matter what. And while that may sound noble, it's actually a dangerous place to be. Because when your entire sense of self is built around what you do for others, what happens when you finally have nothing left to give? Who are you beyond the giving? The truth is, giving should not mean abandoning yourself. You should not have to deplete yourself to prove your kindness, your love, or your loyalty. And yet, so many of us do. We say yes when we are exhausted. We prioritize others' needs over our own. We make sacrifices that no one even asks for, all because we believe that this is what it means to be a good person. But being good to others should never mean being bad to yourself. When you constantly put yourself last, it sends a message to others and to yourself that your needs don't matter, that you don't deserve rest, that your happiness is secondary. And over time, that belief becomes reality, and you stop asking for help. You stop taking care of yourself. You stop even considering that you deserve the same love and energy you give so freely to everyone else. But here's the thing, you do. You deserve balance. You deserve rest. You deserve to be on your own priority list. Giving should come from a place of abundance, not emptiness. And the only way to make that shift is to start honoring yourself the way you honor others. To start valuing your own needs, your own limits, your own well-being. Because when you take care of yourself, you don't just have more to give. You also teach others that your kindness is not a resource to be drained, but a gift to be respected. Overgiving creates an illusion of control. When we constantly give our time, our energy, our resources, we convince ourselves that we are maintaining harmony, that we are preventing disappointment, that we are keeping people close. We believe that by always saying yes, by always being available, we can control how others feel about us. We assume that if we give enough, they won't leave. If we do enough, they will appreciate us. If we sacrifice enough, they will see our worth. But this is not control, it is fear disguised as generosity, and it is exhausting. The hard truth is that overgiving does not guarantee love, loyalty, or appreciation. You can give everything you have, and some people will still take you for granted. You can sacrifice your own well-being, and some people will still expect more. You can bend over backward to be there for everyone, and when you finally need something, you may find yourself standing alone, and that is a painful realization. That no matter how much you give, you cannot control how others treat you. You cannot make someone value you by overextending yourself. Love, respect, and appreciation must be freely given, not forced through effort. Overgiving is often rooted in the fear of rejection. We think that if we set boundaries, we will push people away, that if we say no, we will disappoint them, that if we stop overextending ourselves, we will lose the connections we work so hard to maintain. But here's the truth. The people who truly care about you will not require you to exhaust yourself to keep them in your life. The ones who value you will respect your limits. And the ones who disappear when you stop overgiving, they were only there for what you provided, not for who you are. Stepping away from overgiving means learning to be okay with discomfort. It means realizing that your worth is not tied to how much you do for others. It means understanding that saying no is not an act of selfishness, but an act of self-respect. It means trusting that the right people will stay, even when you stop overextending yourself. And most importantly, it means recognizing that you deserve the same kindness and care that you so freely give to everyone else. When you stop overgiving, you reclaim your energy. You create space for relationships that are balanced, for connections that are built on mutual respect. You shift from giving out of fear to giving out of love, from obligation to choice. And that changes everything, because true generosity does not come from depletion, it comes from abundance. And the most valuable thing you can offer the world is not your exhaustion, not your sacrifice, not your endless giving. It is your whole, healthy, and fulfilled self. And that begins the moment you decide that you are enough, even without overgiving. Overgiving is often mistaken for kindness, but in reality it can be a way of avoiding deeper issues within ourselves. When we constantly focus on others, on their needs, their problems, their happiness, we divert attention away from our own. It becomes easier to give endlessly than to sit with our own discomfort, our own wounds, our own unmet needs. And without realizing it, we start using overgiving as a way to feel needed, as a way to prove our worth, as a way to distract ourselves from the work we need to do internally. At its core, overgiving is not always about generosity. It is about seeking validation. It is about the fear that if we stop giving, we will no longer be valued. That if we stop fixing, we will no longer be wanted. That if we stop overextending ourselves, we will lose the connection we desperately seek. But real connection, real self-worth, does not come from how much we give to others. It comes from how we treat ourselves. When we constantly give without setting boundaries, we are telling ourselves that our own needs don't matter. We are reinforcing the idea that our worth is tied to how useful we are to others. And over time, this creates a deep disconnect, a gap between who we are and who we believe we have to be in order to be loved. But love, real love, is not earned through exhaustion. True relationships do not require you to sacrifice yourself just to be worthy of them. The moment you stop overgiving, you are forced to sit with yourself, to ask yourself why you have been giving so much in the first place, to explore the discomfort that comes with setting limits, the guilt that arises when you finally say no. But that discomfort is where healing begins. It is where you learn that your value is not in what you do for others, but in who you are at your core. It is where you realize that taking care of yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. Shifting away from overgiving does not mean you stop caring. It means you start caring in a way that includes yourself. It means giving from a place of wholeness, not depletion. It means recognizing that your needs are just as important as anyone else's. And the more you embrace this truth, the more you will attract people who respect you, not just for what you offer, but for the person you are, without the endless giving, without the self-sacrifice, without the need to prove your worth, because you were always enough, even before you gave anything at all. Overgiving often leads to an invisible but dangerous pattern. You start to believe that your worth is tied to what you do for others. It's not intentional and it doesn't happen overnight. But every time you put someone else's needs ahead of your own, every time you exhaust yourself trying to keep people happy, every time you say yes when you really want to say no, you reinforce the belief that your value comes from how much you give. And that belief is hard to break because for a while it feels good. It feels like purpose, like connection, like love. But here's the reality. When your identity is built around overgiving, you lose sight of who you are without it. You become the person who is always there, always available, always willing to sacrifice. And because you've always been that person, the people around you expect it. They don't question it. They assume you will always say yes because you always have. And suddenly your relationships aren't built on mutual effort or genuine connection. They are built on what you can provide. That is not love. That is not respect. That is a cycle of self-abandonment disguised as generosity. The danger of this pattern is that it slowly erodes your sense of self. When you spend so much time catering to others, you stop checking in with yourself. So when others with what do you need? What do you want? What makes you happy? You might not even know anymore because you've been too busy making sure everyone else is okay. And if you keep ignoring your own needs, resentment starts to build. Not because you don't care, but because deep down you realize that no one is giving to you in the same way. That no one is checking on you the way you check on them. That no one is making sacrifices for you the way you do for them. Breaking this cycle requires you to redefine where your worth comes from. You are not valuable because of what you do for others. You are valuable simply because you exist. You deserve love, respect, and support, not because of how much you give, but because you are a person who deserves those things just as much as anyone else. And when you start to believe that, everything changes. You stop overgiving out of fear. You stop seeking validation through exhaustion. You start setting boundaries, and in doing so, you teach the people around you that your kindness is a gift, not an expectation. True self-worth does not come from overextending yourself. It comes from knowing that you are enough, exactly as you are, with or without the endless giving. And once you truly believe that, you no longer feel the need to prove it. Overgiving often comes from a deep-rooted desire to feel needed. It's not just about generosity. It's about finding a sense of purpose in being the one others rely on. When people turn to you for help, validation, or support, it gives you a sense of importance, a feeling that you matter. And for a while, that can be fulfilling. But over time, this pattern can become a trap, one that leaves you drained, unappreciated, and struggling to recognize your own worth outside of what you provide for others. The danger of constantly giving without limits is that it fosters one-sided relationships. When you make yourself the problem solver, the caretaker, the one who always steps up, people begin to expect it. It stops being seen as kindness and starts being taken for granted. And the more you give, the less they reciprocate. Not because they are bad people, but because you have trained them, intentionally or not, to see your giving as normal, as automatic, as part of who you are. But who are you outside of what you do for them? That is the question overgivers often avoid asking because the answer can be unsettling. When your identity is built around being needed, the idea of saying no feels terrifying. If you stop helping, will they still value you? If you stop sacrificing, will they still care? If you set boundaries, will they still stay? These fears keep you stuck in a cycle of overgiving, convincing you that your worth is conditional, that it depends on how much you do for others. But real love, real friendship, real respect is never conditional. The people who truly care about you don't require your exhaustion as proof of your loyalty. They don't measure your value by how much you sacrifice. They appreciate you for who you are, not just what you can offer. Stepping away from overgiving means redefining what it means to be valuable. It means recognizing that you don't have to be everything for everyone to be worthy of love and respect. It means understanding that the right people will respect your boundaries, not resent them. It means believing that your presence alone, not your effort, not your sacrifices, is enough. And when you start living from that place, everything changes. Your relationships become healthier, your energy returns, and most importantly, you start to reconnect with yourself. Because at the end of the day, your purpose is not to constantly give until you have nothing left. Your purpose is to live fully, to love deeply, and to be valued for who you are, not just for what you do. Overgiving often creates an illusion of control. When you constantly give to others, your time, your energy, your emotional support, you feel like you are holding everything together. You convince yourself that if you just keep showing up, keep helping, keep sacrificing, everything will be okay. You believe that your effort can fix relationships, make people stay, or even change how they treat you. But the truth is, overgiving does not give you control. It only leads to exhaustion, disappointment, and a growing sense of resentment. The problem is that when you overgive, you assume responsibility for things that are not yours to carry. You take on the emotions of others, trying to fix their problems as if they were your own. You say yes to things you don't have the capacity for because you fear what might happen if you say no. You stretch yourself thin, hoping that if you just do a little more, people will appreciate you, respect you, or finally reciprocate your efforts. But in reality, overgiving does not create stronger relationships. It creates unbalanced ones. It teaches people that they can take without giving, that your needs come second, that your kindness has no limits. And when you finally reach a breaking point, when you start feeling drained and unappreciated, you realize that all your effort has not changed the outcome. Letting go of overgiving means letting go of the need to control everything. It means understanding that you cannot make people value you by exhausting yourself for them. You cannot make someone stay by giving more than you have. You cannot force someone to treat you better by proving your worth through sacrifice. True connection is not built on overextension. It is built on mutual effort, respect, and boundaries. This shift is uncomfortable at first. It feels unnatural to say no, to step back, to stop carrying more than your fair share. But when you do, you begin to see things more clearly. You start to notice who values you for who you are, not just for what you provide. You start to reclaim your energy, your time, and your peace. And most importantly, You start to understand that real control does not come from overgiving, it comes from knowing your limits and standing firm in them. You were never meant to carry everything alone. You were never meant to give until you have nothing left. The people who truly care about you will not require you to exhaust yourself to prove your worth. They will respect your boundaries, honor your needs, and appreciate you not just for what you give, but for who you are. Overgiving often leads to the painful realization that no matter how much you do for others, it will never be enough to make them appreciate you in the way you expect. You pour yourself into people, believing that your kindness, your sacrifice, your effort will eventually come back to you. But over time, you start to notice a pattern. You are always the one giving, always the one adjusting, always the one carrying the emotional weight of relationships. And yet, when you need support, when you need someone to pour into you the way you have for them, there is silence. This is where resentment begins to build. Not because you don't want to give, but because you realize that the giving is one-sided. You start to feel invisible, like your efforts go unnoticed, like people only remember you when they need something. It's not that they don't care at all, but they have learned that you will always say yes, always show up, always be available. They have come to expect it. And the painful truth is that people rarely appreciate what they believe they are entitled to. Overgiving convinces you that if you just give a little more, people will finally see your worth. But that is a trap. Your worth is not something that needs to be proven through exhaustion. The people who truly value you do not need you to overextend yourself for them to recognize your importance in their lives. They appreciate you not because of what you do for them, but because of who you are. And the more you overgive, the more you attract people who take rather than people who reciprocate. Breaking free from this cycle means acknowledging that your time, energy, and emotional capacity are just as important as anyone else's. It means recognizing that the right people will not expect you to drain yourself to prove your love, loyalty, or dedication. It means setting boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect yourself. And it means understanding that the love, appreciation, and respect you seek from others must first come from within. When you stop overgiving, you start to notice who stays when the giving stops. You see who values you for more than what you provide. You realize that the people who truly matter will respect your limits, not guilt you into crossing them. And most importantly, you begin to reclaim yourself. Not as someone whose worth is tied to how much they do for others, but as someone who is valuable simply for being. Because at the end of the day, the people who are meant to be in your life will never require you to abandon yourself in order to keep them. Overgiving often leads to the painful realization that no matter how much you do for others, it will never be enough to make them appreciate you in the way you expect. You pour yourself into people, believing that your kindness, your sacrifice, your effort will eventually come back to you. But over time, you start to notice a pattern. You are always the one giving, always the one adjusting, always the one carrying the emotional weight of relationships. And yet, when you need support, when you need someone to pour into you the way you have for them, there is silence. This is where resentment begins to build. Not because you don't want to give, but because you realize that the giving is one-sided. You start to feel invisible, like your efforts go unnoticed, like people only remember you when they need something. It's not that they don't care at all, but they have learned that you will always say yes, always show up, always be available. They have come to expect it. And the painful truth is that people rarely appreciate what they believe they are entitled to. Overgiving convinces you that if you just give a little more, people will finally see your worth. But that is a trap. Your worth is not something that needs to be proven through exhaustion. The people who truly value you do not need you to overextend yourself for them to recognize your importance in their lives. They appreciate you not because of what you do for them, but because of who you are. And the more you overgive, the more you attract people who take rather than people who reciprocate. Breaking free from this cycle means acknowledging that your time, energy, and emotional capacity are just as important as anyone else's. It means recognizing that the right people will not expect you to drain yourself to prove your love, loyalty, or dedication. It means setting boundaries, not to punish others, but to protect yourself. And it means understanding that the love, appreciation, and respect you seek from others must first come from within. When you stop overgiving, you start to notice who stays when the giving stops. You see who values you for more than what you provide. You realize that the people who truly matter will respect your limits, not guilt you into crossing them. And most importantly, you begin to reclaim yourself. Not as someone whose worth is tied to how much they do for others, but as someone who is valuable simply for being. Because at the end of the day, the people who are meant to be in your life will never require you to abandon yourself in order to keep them. Overgiving often creates a dangerous imbalance in relationships, one that can leave you feeling depleted, undervalued, and unappreciated. When you constantly give more than you receive, you start to believe that love, friendship, or respect must be earned through effort. You tell yourself that if you just give a little more, if you just try a little harder, people will recognize your value. But the truth is, overgiving does not build deeper connections. It builds dependence, expectation, and eventually resentment. At first, it feels good to be the one people rely on. You take pride in being dependable, in showing up when others don't, in being the person who can always be counted on. But over time, this role becomes exhausting. You realize that while you are pouring into everyone else, no one is pouring into you. Your kindness, once appreciated, is now expected. Your generosity, once acknowledged, is now taken for granted. And the worst part? You start to feel like if you stop giving, the relationship will suffer, or worse, fall apart entirely. That fear keeps you trapped in the cycle of overgiving. You don't want to let people down. You don't want to be seen as selfish. You don't want to lose the connections you've worked so hard to maintain. So you keep giving even when it drains you. You keep saying yes even when you desperately want to say no. You keep showing up for others even when no one is showing up for you. And in the process, you lose yourself. You forget that relationships should be mutual, that love and respect should not require sacrifice to be validated. The truth is, if a relationship is only sustained by your overgiving, it is not a healthy relationship. Real connection is not built on obligation, it is built on reciprocity. The people who truly care about you will not require you to exhaust yourself just to maintain a place in their lives. They will respect your boundaries, acknowledge your efforts, and most importantly, give back in return. Stepping away from overgiving does not mean you stop being kind, generous, or supportive. It means you start valuing yourself as much as you value others. It means recognizing that your needs matter too. It means understanding that saying no is not selfish, it is self-respect. And when you begin to prioritize yourself, you attract the right kind of people, those who don't just take but also give. Because real love, real friendship, and real connection are not built on overgiving. They are built on balance, respect, and mutual effort. Overgiving can be a way of avoiding deeper truths about yourself and your relationships. When you constantly give, when you always prioritize others over yourself, it can be a distraction from facing what truly needs to be addressed. It feels easier to focus on someone else's needs, to pour all your energy into fixing their problems, rather than looking inward and asking yourself the difficult questions. Why do I feel the need to give so much? What am I hoping to receive in return? Am I afraid of what will happen if I stop? For many, overgiving is tied to self-worth. You may have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that your value comes from what you do for others, that love, appreciation, and acceptance must be earned through service. This belief keeps you stuck in a pattern where you feel obligated to prove yourself over and over again. But the problem with tying your worth to what you give is that it makes your self-esteem fragile. If people stop needing you, if they stop asking for your help, you may start to feel lost. You may question whether you are still valuable, still worthy, still important. And that fear can drive you to keep giving, even when it comes at the cost of your own well-being. But real self-worth does not come from how much you do for others. It comes from within. It is not about being needed. It is about knowing your value regardless of what you provide. When you let go of overgiving, you make space to develop a stronger sense of self. You begin to recognize that you are more than your role in other people's lives. You start to ask yourself what you need, what you want, what makes you feel fulfilled outside of serving others. And that is where true confidence begins. Breaking the habit of overgiving is uncomfortable at first. It forces you to sit with yourself, to acknowledge the reasons you've been overextending, to confront the fear that you might lose people if you stop. But what you gain is so much greater. You gain clarity, you gain emotional freedom, you gain relationships that are built on mutual respect rather than unspoken obligation. And most importantly, you gain a deeper connection with yourself. Because when you stop overgiving, you don't just reclaim your time and energy, you reclaim your identity. You realize that your worth has never been tied to how much you do for others. It has always existed within you. And once you recognize that, everything changes. Overgiving often comes from the belief that if you do more, give more, and sacrifice more, you will finally feel valued and secure in your relationships. It's the subconscious hope that your efforts will earn you appreciation, love, and loyalty. But the reality is, overgiving does not create stronger connections. It creates dependency, imbalance, and exhaustion. When you make it a habit to give beyond your limits, you end up teaching people that your needs come second, that your time is always available, and that you will keep showing up even when you are running on empty. The problem with this cycle is that it often goes unnoticed until you reach a breaking point. At first, you tell yourself that it's just who you are. You are the dependable one, the person who always helps, the one who makes sure everyone else is okay. But over time, that role becomes a burden. You start to feel resentful when people take your kindness for granted. You feel frustrated when they assume you'll always be there, without ever considering what you might need. And yet, even when you recognize this pattern, breaking free from it feels impossible. You fear that if you stop overgiving, people will see you differently, that they might pull away, or even that you will lose relationships entirely. But here's the truth. If a relationship is only sustained by your overgiving, it is not a healthy relationship. Real love, real friendship, and real respect are built on mutual care, not one-sided effort. The people who genuinely value you will not disappear just because you stop overextending yourself. In fact, setting boundaries allows you to see who truly appreciates you for who you are rather than what you do for them. The shift from overgiving to balanced giving starts with self-awareness. You have to recognize that your worth is not tied to how much you do for others. You have to understand that saying no does not mean you are selfish. It means you are honoring yourself. And most importantly, you have to believe that you deserve the same level of care and consideration that you so freely give to others. When you stop overgiving, something incredible happens. You start to attract relationships that are built on genuine connection rather than obligation. You begin to feel lighter, freer, more at peace with yourself. And you realize that the people who truly matter are the ones who respect your boundaries, not the ones who expect you to sacrifice yourself to keep them happy. Overgiving often creates a silent expectation that one day the people you pour into will return the same level of care and effort. You convince yourself that if you keep showing up, if you keep giving without hesitation, if you keep proving your loyalty, then eventually someone will do the same for you. But more often than not, that day never comes. Instead, you find yourself drained, wondering why the same energy you put into others is not coming back to you. The harsh truth is that overgiving teaches people how to treat you. When you constantly put others first, when you make yourself endlessly available, when you give without limits, people start to believe that this is just who you are. They assume you don't have boundaries because you never enforce them. They assume you don't need anything in return because you never ask. And slowly, without realizing it, you create a dynamic where you are the giver and they are the receiver. And not because they are bad people, but because you have set that precedent. This is why stepping back from overgiving is so difficult. It forces you to shift the very foundation of your relationships. It means disrupting patterns that have been built over time. It means saying no when people expect you to say yes. It means choosing yourself when you are used to prioritizing others. And that change can feel uncomfortable. You may worry that people will be upset. You may fear that they will pull away when you stop being the person who always says yes. And the truth is, some people will. But those are the ones who were only there for what you could give, not for who you are. What you must remember is that the right people will respect your boundaries. They will not expect you to overextend yourself to prove your worth. They will not see your limits as a rejection, but as a sign of self-respect. And those are the relationships worth keeping. The ones where your value is not measured by how much you sacrifice, but by who you are as a person. Letting go of overgiving is not about becoming selfish. It is about creating balance. It is about ensuring that your kindness is appreciated, not exploited. It is about making space for the kind of relationships that nourish you instead of depleting you. Because when you stop giving beyond your capacity, you don't lose love, you gain it in its truest, most reciprocal form. Overgiving often stems from the deep-rooted fear of disappointing others. You say yes when you want to say no. You stretch yourself thin to meet everyone's needs, believing that if you give enough, you will be seen as worthy, reliable, and irreplaceable. But what this really does is put you in a cycle where your happiness depends on external validation, where your peace is sacrificed for the comfort of others, and where your needs are consistently pushed to the side. At first, it may feel like overgiving strengthens your relationships. People appreciate your generosity, they admire your selflessness, and they recognize you as the person who is always there. But over time, this becomes an expectation rather than a choice. The more you give, the more people come to assume that you will always be available, always willing, always ready to pour into them, regardless of whether you have anything left to give. The weight of these unspoken expectations starts to feel heavier. You begin to notice that while you are there for everyone, no one is truly there for you in the same way. When you need help, support, or simply someone to listen, it feels like the people you've poured into are nowhere to be found. And that's when the resentment begins to build. You wonder why your kindness isn't reciprocated, why people don't show up for you the way you show up for them. But the truth is, when you build relationships on overgiving, you train people to take more than they give. You teach them that your needs are secondary, that your time is unlimited, that your presence is guaranteed, whether they appreciate it or not. The solution is not to stop giving, but to give in a way that honors both yourself and others. You need to recognize that saying no does not make you unkind, unreliable, or selfish. It makes you human. You need to remind yourself that real relationships are built on mutual effort, not one-sided sacrifice. And most importantly, you need to understand that disappointing others is not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is losing yourself in the process of trying to please everyone else. When you stop overgiving, you begin to reclaim your energy, your time, and your sense of self-worth. You attract people who respect your boundaries rather than those who test them. You create space for relationships that are built on genuine connection rather than silent obligation. And most importantly, you learn that your value is not determined by how much you do for others, but by who you are with or without the giving. Overgiving is often disguised as kindness. But in reality, it can be a response to deeper fears. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as unworthy. You may believe that if you give enough, if you always say yes, if you constantly show up for others, then you will be loved, accepted, and valued. But the truth is, overgiving does not create stronger connections. It creates imbalance, exhaustion, and a loss of self. When you make a habit of overgiving, you unintentionally teach people that your needs come last. You condition them to believe that you will always be there, no matter what, without ever asking for anything in return. At first, this may make you feel appreciated. You may find comfort in the role of the giver, the dependable one, the person who never lets anyone down. But over time, this role becomes suffocating. You start to feel drained, unseen, and undervalued. You wonder why the same energy you pour into others is not being reciprocated. You question why people only seem to reach out when they need something from you. The answer is simple. When you constantly overgive, you attract people who are comfortable taking. Not because they are necessarily bad people, but because you have created a dynamic where they never have to consider your needs. They assume you are fine, that you don't need help, that you are always willing to give more. And the longer you stay in this cycle, the harder it becomes to break free. But breaking free is necessary, because overgiving does not lead to deeper love or stronger relationships. It leads to burnout and resentment. It leads to feeling used and unappreciated. It leads to a life where you are constantly prioritizing everyone else while neglecting yourself. And that is not sustainable. Choosing to set boundaries does not mean you are becoming selfish. It means you are recognizing your worth. It means you are no longer willing to be drained just to keep others comfortable. It means you are prioritizing relationships that are built on mutual respect rather than silent expectation. The people who truly care about you will not disappear when you stop overgiving. They will respect your limits. They will value you for who you are, not just for what you can do for them. The moment you stop overgiving is the moment you start truly living. You begin to create space for relationships that nourish rather than deplete you. You start to value yourself for more than just what you provide. And most importantly, you realize that your worth has never been dependent on how much you give. It has always existed within you. Overgiving often comes from a place of wanting to be needed, of wanting to prove your worth through how much you can do for others. You tell yourself that if you just give a little more, sacrifice a little more, stretch yourself a little thinner, then maybe you will finally feel valued. But what actually happens? You end up exhausted, drained, and frustrated because the more you give, the more people expect. And the worst part, it never feels like enough. No matter how much you do, there is always something more to give, another favor to say yes to, another request to fulfill. The problem with overgiving is that it creates a dynamic where you become responsible for everyone else's happiness except your own. You put their needs ahead of yours, their comfort above your well-being, their problems before your peace. At first, you may not even realize it's happening. You convince yourself that being generous, kind, and helpful is simply part of who you are. But over time, resentment begins to creep in. You start to notice that the same effort you give is not being returned. You feel unappreciated, like people only come to you when they need something. And yet you still struggle to stop because you fear that if you do, you will disappoint them. But here's the truth. You are not responsible for carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. You are allowed to put yourself first. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to prioritize your energy, your time, and your peace without needing to justify it to anyone. The people who truly respect and care about you will understand. They will not make you feel guilty for setting boundaries. They will not disappear just because you stop overextending yourself. If anything, those are the relationships that will grow stronger because they are based on mutual respect, not silent obligation. The fear of letting people down is one of the biggest reasons people struggle to stop overgiving. But the reality is, disappointing others is inevitable. No matter how much you give, you cannot please everyone. And the more you try, the more you lose yourself in the process. Instead of focusing on keeping everyone else happy, shift your focus to keeping yourself whole. Your energy is valuable, your time is valuable. And when you stop pouring endlessly into people who only take, you create space for the ones who pour back into you. Because real love, real connection, and real appreciation do not require you to drain yourself. They allow you to be fully yourself. Overgiving is often rooted in the belief that your worth is tied to how much you do for others. You have convinced yourself that being constantly available, saying yes to every request, and sacrificing your own needs makes you a good person. You believe that if you keep showing up, keep giving more, keep proving your loyalty, people will appreciate you, love you, and never leave. But the truth is, overgiving doesn't build stronger relationships. It creates imbalance, dependency, and ultimately burnout. When you overgive, you attract people who are comfortable taking. Not necessarily because they are bad people, but because you have made it easy for them. You have taught them that your time, your energy, and your emotional labor are always available. They have no reason to stop asking because you have never given them a reason to. And at first, it may not bother you. You may even take pride in being the reliable one, the problem solver, the person who always has the answers. But over time, you start to feel drained. You start to feel like people only reach out when they need something, like your kindness is being taken for granted. You start to feel invisible, like no one truly sees you beyond what you can do for them. This is where the resentment builds. You find yourself giving, but with an underlying bitterness. You say yes, but you don't really want to. You continue to show up, but inside you are exhausted. And the worst part? You feel stuck in this cycle because saying no feels like a betrayal. You worry that setting boundaries will make people think you are selfish or uncaring. You fear that if you stop overgiving, people will walk away. But here's what you need to understand. The right people will not leave just because you stop overextending yourself. The people who truly care about you will respect your limits. They will appreciate you for who you are, not just for what you do. And those who only stick around because of what they can get from you, they were never really there for you in the first place. Choosing to stop overgiving is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of self-respect. And it is a commitment to valuing yourself as much as you value others. It is a recognition that your energy is not infinite and your worth is not measured by how much you sacrifice. When you start setting boundaries, when you start giving from a place of choice rather than obligation, you begin to attract relationships that are built on mutual respect, not silent expectations. And that is where true connection begins. Overgiving is often mistaken for kindness, but at its core, it can be a survival mechanism, a way to seek validation, maintain relationships, and avoid rejection. You give, not always because you want to, but because you feel like you have to. You tell yourself that if you keep saying yes, if you keep showing up, if you keep putting others first, then you will be appreciated, valued, and loved. But what happens when the giving never stops? What happens when the expectations keep growing and you find yourself stretched so thin that there's nothing left for you? The reality is, when you overgive, you are teaching people how to treat you. Every time you sacrifice your own needs for the comfort of others, you are sending a silent message that your needs don't matter as much. Over time, people begin to expect that you will always be available, always willing, always ready to say yes. And when you finally try to set a boundary, when you finally try to say no, you are met with resistance. Why? Because they have become accustomed to your constant giving, and they don't know how to handle anything different. This is where the exhaustion and resentment begin to build. You start to notice that the same people you pour into are nowhere to be found when you need support. You realize that your kindness has been taken for granted, that people only seem to appreciate you for what you can do for them, not for who you are, and yet you still struggle to stop. You fear that if you stop overgiving, people will be disappointed, relationships will fall apart, and you will be left feeling unworthy. But here's the truth: your worth has never been tied to how much you give. Real relationships, healthy, fulfilling relationships, are built on mutual respect and reciprocity, not one-sided sacrifice. The people who truly care about you will not walk away just because you start setting boundaries. They will not disappear just because you start valuing yourself as much as you value them. And if they do, then they were never really there for you. They were there for what you could offer. Choosing to stop overgiving is choosing to take back your power. It is choosing to value your energy, your time, and your well-being. It is choosing to give from a place of abundance rather than exhaustion. And most importantly, it is choosing to believe that you are enough, with or without the endless giving. The moment you stop overgiving is the moment you reclaim yourself. And that is a decision worth making. Overgiving doesn't build stronger relationships, it drains you. The more you give without limits, the more people expect, leaving you exhausted and unappreciated. But your worth isn't measured by how much you sacrifice. True connections thrive on mutual respect, not one-sided effort. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's self-respect. When you stop overgiving, you don't lose people who truly care, you lose those who only took advantage. Reclaim your energy, value yourself, and give from a place of choice, not obligation. In doing so, you don't just protect your well-being, you reclaim your power. The world needs you whole, not half of you. Stop overgiving. Start honoring yourself. Because when you take care of you first, that's when you truly have something meaningful to give. Thank you.